Hello everyone and welcome to this, my first of two videos on the Ricoh Singlex TLS, a 35mm interchangeable lens SLR. What does that mean? It means that this camera can take any 35mm film. It has a single lens on the front of it that the light passes into and then reaches a mirror inside of it, then goes up to this pentaprism reflex system up here to your eye, so you see exactly what the lens is going to see. Interchangeable lens means quite simply that at any point when you're not taking a photo, you can remove the lens from the front of the camera and put another one on instead. This camera uses a stop-down metering system TTL meter. What that means is that the light coming through the lens is what the camera is going to use to determine the light meter reading for your photo. And stop-down means that the meter is off by default, but when you flip this switch up to where it says on, that turns the meter on, so it will take a meter reading. This also means that it has closed aperture metering. So with this camera, you can adjust the aperture setting right now, and it will, when you take the photo, close down the aperture. But if you don't have a proper shutter speed dialed in for that aperture setting, you'll have an improper exposure. The light meter cannot calculate the exposure speed with the aperture being open. So when you turn this on, the aperture stops down. Let's see if I can get a better shot of that. You might be able to see there that the aperture closes down when the meter pops open or turns on. With this camera, you can only obtain a light meter reading with the switch being on and the aperture being stopped down to the aperture you're going to use. The camera has shutter speeds of 1/1000th of a second on the fast end to as slow as bulb, 1 second being the longest timed shutter speed. And the orange indications here, the orange shutter speeds are your speeds that a flash will work with, and the white ones are the shutter speeds that a flash will not work with. Okay, so you can also use a flash with bulb mode. It's just green because why not? But at any rate, that brings me to the next point, which is that the flash sync speed is 1/125th of a second. The camera uses a matte field focusing area with a central microprism composition ring. So what that means is that when you look in the viewfinder, there's going to be a field where you can focus freely, just a matte field, and then in the center there's like a donut of a slightly different looking matte field, and then in the very middle there's a circle of microprisms. And with microprisms, when something is out of focus, it looks like a bunch of triangles, and when something is in focus, it suddenly snaps into focus. And that's how you can use that as a focusing aid if you have this camera. The Ricoh Singlex TLS had a target market of the mid-market SLR user. Now, when this came out, there were rangefinder users and SLR users and other categories like viewfinders. SLRs were the top tier of 35mm camera. This would have been a mid-range 35mm camera, so compared to all the other cameras on the market, still fairly high end. It had all of the standard photographic or camera features of the time. It has no hot shoe, so when you see the prism back here, there's no hot shoe. It does have the ability with to have a cold shoe mounted onto the prism with the grooves in the viewfinder socket. The battery in this powers only the meter. If your camera's battery interface is dead or the meter's dead, all the mechanical components are separate, so you only need a battery for the meter. The camera can still take a photo just fine without a battery installed. So that means it is a fully mechanical camera. It does have a fast, by the time standards of the time, shutter speed sync of 1/125th. At the time this came out, most cameras, I'm just actually struggling to think of another camera that came out at the same time as this that had a flash sync speed of 1/125th of a second, and I quite frankly, I cannot. This was made by Ricoh in Japan from 1967 until sometime in the 70s. The latest I could find for this was 1974, where there were some Ricoh advertisements in camera magazines for the TLS. Now, if you have your Ricoh TLS, we're going to go through all of the features and what they are. In the second video, we'll talk about what everything does. We'll start here as we do on the top, technically on the front, with this for the strap lugs. This is where you can connect a couple of split rings to connect a strap to your camera. This is your film memo dial and film memo dial index. What you would do when you load a roll of film is you would simply rotate this dial to indicate if you have color film, and daylight color film is D, and tungsten color film is T. Or if you are using no film, it's empty, or if you're using black and white film. So tungsten film was important back in the day because it was balanced for tungsten lighting, which was was standard for interior lighting. Tungsten light's very warm. If you use daylight balanced film inside, all of your images would look kind of yellow-orange. So that's the difference there. And then it's color or slide, it doesn't really matter because there were tungsten balanced and daylight balanced versions of both. So more importantly was whether you were using tungsten or daylight film. Here's your film rewind knob and lever. This is what we'll use to rewind the film when we're done. This is your film plane indicator. Your prism, you can see, has no hot shoe, but here in the sides of the viewfinder, there are a couple of accessory grooves. And if you have the accessory cold shoe, now you can put that on top and have something to mount a flash onto your camera with. We'll talk about how actually to use a flash a little bit in the second video. This is your film advance lever right here. So after you take a photo, you advance the film and rearm the shutter with that. Shutter button, serial number, and this is your frame count window. On the front of the camera, we have a number of different things. The make, model, or family, I guess technically, and model for this. Here we have the combination shutter speed and ASA dial. ASA is film speed. ASA and ISO are the exact same thing. So when you load film, and we'll see how to do that in the second video, your film's ISO is the same number as ASA, and you just set it here by lifting the dial and rotating to select your film speed, just like that. Self-timer lever. This is pretty straightforward. You arm it, and then when you push the shutter button, the mirror is going to pop up and the aperture is going to close when this flappy paddle here pops forward, and then after the timer, the shutter will fire. What this flappy paddle does is engage with this pin on the lens. When that pin is pushed in, because that flappy paddle pops forward, that pin closes the aperture on the lens. And that's how the camera controls the aperture with an M42 lens. This is the light meter switch right here. On this side of the camera, we have two things of importance, X and M. These ports look exactly the same, but they are different. X is these are both flash sync ports. X is your modern type of flash. If you went out and you bought a flash today and it has a reusable bulb in it, that's an X flash. If you have a flash that uses single-use bulbs, that would be connected to this M. If you're going to use a flash with this camera, in all probability, you are only ever going to use this port right here for X flashes. And what it does is you need a flash PC, pront or compor, per however it's pronounced, cable, and you just plug it into the port right there, and that's how you trigger the flash with this camera. On the back of the camera, there's really not a whole lot to see. The viewfinder. On the camera's bottom, we have a few things. The film rewind release button right here, tripod socket, made in Japan, and here's the battery chamber where we'll load the battery in the second video. The next thing we're going to do is take a look inside the camera and see what's there. To get into the camera, simply lift up the film rewind knob until the back pops open. Over here on this side, we have the film cassette chamber. When we load film in the second video, this is where we'll load it. These rails here are the guide rails. When film is loaded, it rests like this. The outside rails are used to keep the film from moving up and down, and the inside rails will sandwich against the film pressure plate that we'll see in a minute to keep the film flat so that the light is properly focused on the film when a photo is taken. At the far end of the guide rail right here, we have a film guide pin. This helps the film leave the cassette smoothly and in the proper orientation. These are your shutter leaves. This is your film tension sprocket, and after you take a photo, the film tension sprocket rolls to advance the film through the camera, and it will not roll backwards so that the film can't accidentally slide back this way. This is your film take-up spool right here, and as you advance the film, you can see that the film take-up spool turns to pull the film through the camera. On the door, we have the film pressure plate right here, and this will help keep the film flat so that the photos are focused properly. And we have a spring up here which helps keep the film cassette, in proper alignment so that the film leaves it and returns to it without getting jammed up. I do have some tips for you to make the most out of the Ricoh Singlex TLS. The first is to remember to stop down the light meter to take your meter reading. If you don't remember to stop down the light meter, you're not going to get a meter reading. You just won't get anything. So you do need to use this whenever you're going to take a meter reading. And now if you're in the same lighting conditions, you only have to take a meter reading one time. But if lighting is changing and so forth, you will need to take a meter reading each time and then manually adjust your aperture and shutter speed as needed. The next thing is that these cameras today are highly, highly affordable. I was shocked. I don't remember how much I paid for this used, obviously, but when I got this, it was dirt cheap. And considering the fact that it has the exact same feature set as a Spotmatic and uses the exact same lenses, but is just a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier, and does in fact have a faster flash sync speed. I mean, heck, realistically, this is a somewhat more capable camera than most of the Spotmatics. And it's really a fantastic option if you're looking for a reliable, robust 35mm camera that you can still use for a class today. And also the Ricoh M42 lenses are phenomenal. And you can also use basically any M42 lens on this camera, and it will be a-okay. So you have access to just tons and tons of camera lenses. I do have some things not to do with your Ricoh Singlex TLS. The first one is anytime you are done for the day, remember to trigger the shutter. If you leave the shutter armed, whenever you advance this film advance lever to arm the shutter, you're putting tension on a bunch of mechanical springs, and if they sit with that tension on them, then they can develop a memory or become fatigued. Mechanical components like springs with a memory can affect their timing and accuracy. Fatigued items can break, and both of those are bad situations for your camera. The next thing is don't touch the shutter curtain in there, because you can brick your shutter curtain, and you don't want to do that. This would be a very hard camera to get repaired today. The next thing is don't touch the mirror that's behind the lens, because your finger oils can get onto that mirror and tarnish it, which will impair your ability to focus and also impair this camera's ability to meter, because the metering cells are in the prism. Don't let your camera get wet. It's not weather sealed, and the components in here will rust if they get too wet. Don't leave your camera in your car, because heat will cause the lubricating oils in the lens to get very thin, and then they can get onto the aperture blades. And when they get back to their proper viscosity, then they don't work correctly. The aperture blades don't. And the same is true for the mechanical components in here. In the extreme cold, the lubricating oils can get very thick and gummy and break down, and then you have lubricating oils that are thick and not working correctly. Also, any camera left in a car, even if you're just hopping out of the car for a minute, is a good theft target. So even if you're just going to go into the gas station to pay for what you filled up from your pump, it's a good idea to take your camera inside with you. Don't leave your gear in a plastic bag or box unless you have a good and rechargeable desiccant pack in it that you keep recharged. And the reason for that is because plastic is moisture permeable. And if moisture gets through that plastic and into your lens, then what can happen is you'll get fungus on your lens, and nobody wants that. It will impair your image quality. And the last thing is just remember that your Ricoh Singlex TLS is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So that's it for the first video. And in the second video, I'll see you over there. We're going to talk about all of the different operational aspects of this camera and how to do basically everything that it can do.